Rome conquered the world, but it never stopped fearing its own people. Not invasions, not enemies, uprisings. Again and again, the empire came dangerously close to tearing itself apart. And worked hard to make sure we forgot. Chapter 1. The Empire Built on Silence. At its height, Rome presented itself as the ultimate triumph of order. Its leaders spoke of Pax Romana, Roman peace, secured by law, discipline, and civilization. Marble temples rose over cities linked by roads and aqueducts. Legal codes standardized life from Britain to Syria. To Roman elites, this system appeared stable, rational, and permanent. But this image was carefully curated. Beneath the architecture and rhetoric lie a society sustained by inequality and coercion. Enslaved people numbered in the millions, forming the backbone of agriculture. Mining, construction, and domestic labor. Small farmers were pushed off their land as estates concentrated in the hands of the elite. Urban populations survived on grain distributions while political power narrowed around senatorial and imperial families. Violence was not a breakdown of order, it was how order functioned. Rome feared invasion, but it feared something else more. External enemies could be defeated by legions. Internal revolt threatened the entire system. Rebellion exposed a dangerous truth. Rome's dominance depended on the compliance of those it ruled. When that compliance fractured, even briefly, the illusion of control collapsed. As a result, Rome responded to unrest with overwhelming force and public punishment. Rebellions were crushed quickly, then reframed. Roman historians minimized their causes, exaggerated their brutality, or erased them altogether. Victories were commemorated in stone, resistance vanished from the record. What survives is a history written almost entirely by those in power. The voices of the defeated, enslaved people, provincials, dispossessed citizens, are largely absent. Yet the sheer repetition of revolt tells its own story. Beneath Rome's confidence ran a constant unease, the knowledge that silence was enforced, not natural, and that it could break. Chapter 2. A world designed to explode by the late Republic and early Empire. Roman society was under extreme internal strain. Conquest had brought wealth into Italy, but it did not distribute it evenly. Vast estates, known as latifundia, expanded across the countryside, worked almost entirely by enslaved labor captured in Rome's wars. Small landowners, unable to compete, fell into debt or lost their farms altogether. Many drifted into cities, where survival depended on irregular work or state grain distributions. Slavery was not peripheral to this system, it was central. By the 1st century BCE, enslaved people may have made up more than a quarter of the population of Italy. They labored in mines, fields, workshops, and households under constant threat of punishment. Roman law defined them as property, but their numbers alone made them a permanent source of anxiety for the state. Free citizens were not immune to pressure. Taxation in the provinces was heavy and often abusive, outsourced to private collectors who profited from excess. Local elites were forced to serve Rome's interests or risk replacement. In times of crisis, communities were expected to absorb losses while imperial demands remained unchanged. Roman expansion intensified these stresses rather than resolving them. Each conquest produced new captives, new wealth, and new inequalities. Stability depended on continued growth, and on the assumption that those at the bottom would endure their position indefinitely. Rome called this condition peace, but it was a peace maintained by force, spectacle, and fear. The system functioned only so long as pressure does not turn into coordination, and history would show that pressure, when sustained long enough, does not simply disappear. Chapter 3. The First Cracks. Early rebellions. Rome survived long before the empire reached its peak. Rome was already learning how fragile its control could be. During the Republican period, unrest repeatedly erupted across Italy and the wider Mediterranean. These were not isolated incidents, but recurring reactions to Roman expansion and domination. One of the earliest and most dangerous challenges came from Rome's own allies. The Social War, from 91 to 88 BCE, saw Italian communities that had long supplied Rome with soldiers and taxes take up arms, not to destroy Rome, but to demand equal citizenship. The Conflict consumed much of the peninsula and forced Rome into a concession it had resisted for generations, extending Roman citizenship to its Italian allies. The war ended in victory, but it exposed how close Rome came to collapse from within. Elsewhere, resistance followed conquest. In Spain, Rome fought decades-long guerrilla wars against local populations, most famously under leaders like Viriathus in the 2nd century BCE. In Sicily, massive slave uprisings in 135 to 132 BCE and again in 104 to 100 BCE created breakaway territories that required full military campaigns to suppress. Rome's response to these crises followed a consistent pattern. Rebellion was met with overwhelming force, public executions, enslavement, and destruction of communities. Punishment was often theatrical, designed to deter future resistance as much as to end the immediate threat. Entire populations could be sold into slavery or displaced. From these early revolts, Rome learned a critical lesson. Fear could restore order, but only temporarily. Each suppression ended one uprising while laying the groundwork for the next. The methods worked, but the need to keep using them revealed a system under constant strain, surviving not through harmony, but through repetition of violence. Chapter 4: Spartacus and the Revolt that Haunted Rome. In 73 BCE, a revolt began that Rome would never fully forget. It started in a gladiatorial training school in Capua, where around 70 enslaved fighters, led by Spartacus, escaped and seized weapons. Spartacus was likely a Thracian who had served as a soldier before being enslaved. What followed was not a riot, but a sustained military campaign that exposed the deepest vulnerabilities of the Roman state. Within months, tens of thousands of enslaved people and rural laborers joined the uprising. Roman forces initially underestimated the threat, dispatching poorly prepared militias rather than full legions. They were repeatedly defeated. By 72 BCE, Spartacus's army had crushed multiple Roman commanders and moved freely across southern Italy. At its height, the rebel force may have numbered over 60,000. The revolt terrified Rome because it defied expectations. Enslaved people were not supposed to organize, maneuver, or defeat Roman armies in open battle. Yet they did. The Senate was forced to grant extraordinary command to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, who imposed harsh discipline on his troops, including decimation. By 71 BCE, the rebellion was crushed through attrition and superior resources. Spartacus was killed in the final battle. His body was never identified. In the aftermath, approximately 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, stretching from Capua to Rome, a deliberate display meant to burn the cost of resistance into public memory. Roman sources reduced the revolt to criminal disorder. What they avoided confronting was its scale and competence. For nearly 2 years, Rome lost control of its own countryside. The uprising revealed that the system Rome depended on could, under the right conditions, turn into an organized force capable of shaking the republic itself. Chapter 5: Provincial Fury. When the empire turned on itself as Rome expanded beyond Italy, rebellion followed the empire into its provinces. These uprisings were not sudden eruptions of chaos, but responses to Roman administration, taxation, land seizure, military occupation, and cultural disruption. They occurred across regions separated by thousands of miles, yet driven by strikingly similar pressures. In Britannia, revolt erupted in 60 or 61 CE after Roman officials confiscated property and abused local elites. Boudica, queen of the Iceni, led a coalition of tribes that destroyed the Roman towns of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. Tens of thousands were killed before Roman legions regrouped and crushed the uprising. The revolt forced Rome to reconsider how aggressively it governed newly conquered territories. In Judea, resistance was more prolonged and catastrophic. The first Jewish revolt, beginning in 66 CE, was fueled by religious tensions, heavy taxation, and Roman interference in local governance. Roman forces eventually besieged Jerusalem, destroying the Second Temple in 70 CE, a defining trauma in Jewish history. Further revolts followed, most notably the Bar Kokhba uprising from 132 to 136 CE, which required massive military commitment and resulted in widespread devastation and depopulation. In Gaul and North Africa, localized revolts flared repeatedly, often led by regional elites pushed aside by Roman authority. These movements were not coordinated, but they frightened Roman administrators precisely because they did not need to be. Rome labeled these uprisings as barbarian violence or religious fanaticism, yet their causes were consistent: loss of autonomy, economic extraction, and the presence of occupying forces. The empire's greatest fear was not any single rebellion, but the possibility that distant provinces might recognize shared grievances and resist together. Chapter 6: Erasing Resistance. How Rome controlled memory. Rome did not rely on force alone to maintain control. It also shaped how events were remembered. Nearly all surviving accounts of rebellion come from Roman elites, senators, officials, or historians writing under imperial patronage. Figures such as Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio recorded uprisings almost exclusively from the perspective of the state. Rebels appear as criminals, fanatics, or threats to order, while their motivations are reduced or ignored. The absence is deliberate. Enslaved people, provincials, and defeated communities left few written records that survived. Roman suppression. Literacy was limited, and archives belonged to those in power. When cities were destroyed, their histories often vanished with them. What remained was a narrative curated to justify Roman authority. Public space reinforced this version of events. Triumphs celebrated victories while omitting the cost. Monuments, such as the Arch of Titus, commemorated the destruction of Jerusalem not as tragedy, but as achievement. Inscriptions named emperors and generals, never the communities erased in the process. Even failed revolts were transformed into warnings, examples of what happened to those who resisted Rome. This control of memory served a purpose. By stripping rebellions of context, Rome prevented future resistance from finding precedent. Revolt appeared isolated, futile, and illegitimate. There was no lineage of resistance, only scattered disturbances, quickly resolved by Roman strength. Yet, the repetition of suppression hints at what the official record conceals. Rebellions occurred too often, across too many regions, to be anomalies. Rome erased resistance not because it was insignificant, but because remembering it truthfully would have exposed how unstable imperial rule truly was, and how often it was challenged. Chapter 7: Revolt without armies, everyday resistance. Not all resistance to Rome took the form of open rebellion. In fact, much of it unfolded quietly, embedded in daily life and largely invisible to Roman chroniclers. Enslaved people resisted through flight, work slowdowns, theft, and sabotage, actions that disrupted productivity without requiring organized revolt. Roman legal texts and household manuals reveal constant concern about enslaved workers feigning illness, damaging tools, or coordinating escapes. Desertion was another persistent problem. Soldiers stationed far from home sometimes abandoned their posts, especially during prolonged campaigns or in unstable provinces. Roman commanders complained of unreliable auxiliary forces recruited from conquered populations. Men expected to enforce Roman authority among their own communities. In the provinces, resistance could take cultural forms. Local languages, religious practices, and social customs endured despite official pressure to adopt Roman norms. In Judea, refusal to participate in imperial cult rituals was itself an act of defiance. In Gaul and Britain, indigenous religious sites continued to function alongside Roman temples, sometimes blending traditions in ways that resisted full assimilation. Even urban populations resisted in subtle ways. Food riots, tax evasion, and refusal to cooperate with census officials forced Roman authorities to intervene repeatedly. These acts lacked the drama of open revolt, but they were constant, costly, and difficult to eliminate. Roman officials understood the danger. A society does not need armies to resist, it needs numbers and persistence. These everyday acts revealed a fundamental truth: Roman rule depended on participation as much as force. When cooperation weakened, even quietly, the empire felt it. Resistance did not always aim to overthrow Rome. Often, it sought survival, dignity, or small spaces of autonomy. And precisely because it was so ordinary, it was impossible to fully destroy. Chapter 8. The truth that could have destroyed the empire. Rome did not fall because its people forgot how to govern or fight. For centuries, the empire remained administratively sophisticated, militarily formidable, and culturally influential. What it never resolved was the contradiction at its core. A system that depended on obedience while producing the conditions for resistance. Imperial stability was achieved through suppression, not consent. Slavery, heavy taxation, and political exclusion were not temporary measures, they were permanent features of Roman rule. Each revolt was treated as an exception, yet their frequency suggests something more systemic. Rome endured not because rebellion was rare, but because it was repeatedly crushed. This strategy worked in the short term. Fear restored order, deterred coordination, and reinforced hierarchy. But it also ensured that resentment never disappeared. The empire survived by preventing unity among the discontented, isolating revolts in time and place, erasing their causes, and controlling how they were remembered. Over time, this approach narrowed Rome's options. When crises multiplied, economic strain, military overextension, political instability, the empire faced them with tools designed for suppression, not reform. Resistance no longer needed to organize, it only needed to persist. The dangerous truth Rome suppressed was simple. Its power was not inevitable. It was conditional. It relied on millions of people continuing to endure a system that offered them little in return. When that endurance weakened, through revolt, withdrawal, or indifference, the foundations of empire eroded. The revolts Rome erased were warnings. They revealed how close the empire came, again and again, to unraveling from within. The question is not whether Rome faced resistance. It is how many similar warnings have been buried by powerful societies since, and how many remain unheard. Rome wanted its story to end with triumph, monuments standing, enemies silenced, history settled, but the revolts it erased tell a different story, one of pressure, resistance, and people who refused to disappear quietly. These were not footnotes, they were warnings about power built on fear and about systems that survive by suppressing memory. If you want more history that looks past empires and listens for the voices they tried to bury, stay here. Subscribe. The stories that shaped the world are rarely the ones written in stone.